if I'm thinking about total economic surplus, sorry. If I think about, is that way too loud? Yes? Okay. Where's my, oh, come on. All right, we'll see if this works. I'll lower it down a little bit. Is that better? You guys hear me in the back? Good? Okay. So if I think about the very first unit, right, what's the marginal benefit of that first unit to the consumer who buys it? It's represented by the point that we're at on the demand curve. What's the marginal cost to the consumer? It's not the supply curve. That represented the marginal cost of our producers. What's the marginal cost to the consumers? We just said it was the price they pay. So that very first unit, kind of the total economic surplus would be that difference between the marginal cost to the consumer and their marginal benefit. What about the second unit? Marginal benefit and the marginal cost, which is the price. What about the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth, et cetera? Now, I've drawn this as kind of jumps, but really when I buy the first unit, all of this would represent the surplus of the very first unit. This is just kind of a different way of thinking about it. So when we're talking about consumer surplus, it's going to be the difference between the marginal benefit or the demand curve to the consumers and the consumer's marginal cost, which is the price. So this entire area is going to represent to us the consumer surplus or total consumer surplus in this market. For every unit purchased, the total net benefit, I said that's one way to think about economic surplus, the total net benefit or the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost for the consumers would be represented by this entire triangle. Okay? Any questions on that idea? Okay. Well, since we're here, we'll jump with the gun a little bit and we'll go through the slides a little bit quicker. What if I think about producer surplus? What's the marginal benefit to producers? When I sell something, the benefit to me is the price I'm selling it for. So now the equilibrium price, if I'm thinking about the net benefit, so when I say like net benefit, I'm thinking about what's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. Well, to producers, what is the marginal benefit? It is the price, and the marginal cost is represented by the supply curve. So for our producers, what's the net benefit of every unit? It's the difference between the price and their marginal cost, which is represented by the supply curve. So for every unit, here would be the producer surplus, or if we're doing this more continuously, not kind of like as integers, that total producer surplus would be the area below the equilibrium price, but above our supply curve. If I add those two things together, what do you think that represents? I said it earlier. Total economic surplus of this market. It's composed of two things, producer and consumer surplus. So at this allocative efficient point, it's maximized. And you can start to think about why. Let's say that consumers went past that equilibrium quantity. If they keep paying this price, what's the net benefit to consumers? Their marginal benefit, represented by this demand curve, well, now their marginal benefit for all of these units would be below their marginal cost. So what would the net benefit be here? If the benefits are lower than the cost, it would be negative. Do I want to buy something if it has a negative net benefit to me? No. So they would want to stop here. What about for producers? If they go past this quantity, what's their marginal benefit? We said that was the price. The supply curve represents, so every unit here, what would be true about producer surplus? It would be, so if I'm adding negative surplus, what's happening to total economic surplus? It would just be going down. So at that allocative efficient quantity, what must be true? Anything past this point, total economic surplus will go down. So if we stop here, that's where it's at its maximum. Okay? So the allocative efficient point of a market will give us the highest amount of total economic surplus. Okay? Any questions over anything here before we keep moving? Okay? So I kind of already drew this out for us, right? But here was our consumer surplus, below demand, above price. I could think about mathematically. Now, we're not going to use this, and you guys don't even, I'm not even expecting you to know what a summation sign is, although hopefully a lot of you do. But right, you're just adding up every quantity that difference between consumers' marginal benefit and their marginal cost, which is the price. Okay. And then if we kind of continued, excuse me, if I want to make these actual calculations, let's say I had the price here, right? What would total consumer surplus be? So it's the area of a what? Triangle. How do you find the area of a triangle? Good. So how would I find the height? It's where that demand curve starts at 100 down to the price, which is 40. So the height would be 60. What is the base of my triangle always going to be if my market's in equilibrium? I'm going to go from 0. Where did I just say we would stop? The equilibrium quantity, right? So if this was the equilibrium price, that equilibrium quantity we know is at 50. So the base of my triangle when calculating consumer and producer surplus before government interaction, we'll add some of that in later today, but also focus on it Thursday. But for right now, without government interaction, when a market is in equilibrium, the base of that triangle for calculating consumer surplus will always be our equilibrium quantity. So what? 60 times 50 is 300. So that's my consumer surplus. I then need to do what? Multiply it by 1/2, right? So I've got what? 60 times 50. Oh, sorry, I said 300. 3,000, right? Multiplied by half should give me 1,500, right? So we're really just calculating the area of triangles here. At the end of the day, before government interaction, we're just calculating the area of triangles. Nothing too crazy when we're determining what the economic surplus is, whether it's consumer or producer surplus. Okay. Any questions here? Shouldn't be too bad. Producer surplus, we've already talked about this as well. It's going to be the area below the equilibrium price, but above our supply curve. Once again, it's the area of a triangle, right? What's the base of my triangle always going to be? What does this point represent? Equilibrium quantity. What is the height? Well, that doesn't represent anything. That's just going to be the difference between where my supply curve starts and that equilibrium price. So once again, just across every single unit, and this Q, we know that we're going to stop at the equilibrium quantity. So for every quantity, we add up the difference between the price and that supply curve. So if I had something like this, I'm not going to spend as much time. This should be pretty easy. I now know I want the area below price, but above my supply curve. So the height is going to be what? 50. Equilibrium quantity, still 50. So 50 times 50, I get what? 2,500. It's a triangle. I need to multiply it by half. So 1,250. Okay. So just calculating the area of triangles when we're first determining what consumer and producer surplus is when a market is in equilibrium. Okay. Any questions here? Like I said, I'm going through this stuff a little quicker. Module 5, I think it's a little bit easier than maybe what the book makes it out to be. So that's why I go a little bit quicker. So I was going to have these, so like, if we think about producer and consumer surplus, the idea is that when I pay the equilibrium price, every single person, except for the last person that bought that good, what was true about the demand curve? The marginal benefit was what relative to the price? Above it. So every single person they paid whatever the equilibrium price was, but they would have been willing to pay up to a much higher amount. So they're better off. They would have paid more and they didn't have to. So they have like a net benefit. That's why I use this term to kind of can think about. So there, my consumer surplus is always going to be the difference between how much would I have paid, and we know that they would pay up to their marginal benefit, and the price I actually paid. Right? And then for producers, right, they receive a certain amount of money, but they would have been willing to accept whatever their cost was, right, all the way down in that marginal cost curve. So the price that they received was above that point on their supply curve, so they actually got more money than they would have taken a lot less. So that difference would represent producer surplus. Okay, and if you don't get this, go watch Pretty Woman. This is Pretty Woman, right? That's the name of the movie. I'm bad with movies, but I've seen it, and it lines up, right? So literally, this is Module 5. This is why I combine Module 5 and 6, because at its core, that's all Module 5 is. Understanding and making this connection between economic surplus for both producers and consumers. So when I say consumer or producer surplus, technically I could say a longer, which is consumer economic surplus and producer economic surplus. I'll generally just kind of refer to them as consumer producer surplus just to kind of make it a little bit shorter. Okay. All right. So any questions before we keep moving. Now we're essentially going to be diving into like module 6 topics. Okay. You good with this? Okay. So markets are in equilibrium. I said total economic surplus when it's at equilibrium will be what? We said if I went past that equilibrium quantity, what started to happen? We started to add negative surplus. So at that allocative efficient point at the equilibrium, what was maximized? Total economic surplus. Okay. So what can go wrong, right? The government can go wrong, right? They can kind of get involved, and we can kind of see when the government steps in, they can actually reduce that total economic surplus, and we introduce another type of surplus, a couple types that we'll think about. But we'll start out with what the government can do first. So they can set price floors or price ceilings. This is not as obvious when you look at real world examples of them setting price floors or ceilings, but it happens, especially in like the agricultural markets, right? They can kind of put a top amount you can charge. You'll see rent controls, right? In certain areas, they tell people, like they tell whatever apartment or people who are renting, you can't charge a price above this, like especially if it's low income housing or things like that. So we do see the government use these price floors and ceilings, and I'll try to point out a couple examples of this. Now, one that we see a lot more often is maybe quotas, right? We don't allow there to be a certain amount, more than this amount of units out there in the market. We prevent people from producing past a certain point, or we force them sometimes to produce more. So for everything we're going to do in this class, we're just going to look at quota restrictions. There are quota, like you must make this amount. We're not going to talk about those. We could, but I'm going to try to simplify, not throw as many things at you, okay? Now, we also have what's probably more commonly used by the government would be what we would call like, not quantity controls, but like we're adding in costs or benefits to consumers or producers by using taxes or subsidies. Right? So we're going to look at how do taxes and subsidies influence efficiency of our market. So it's going to push us away from that equilibrium quantity. It's also going to create something we end up calling deadweight loss, which is just the loss of total economic surplus. Because if we move away from that allocated efficient quantity, we know total economic surplus has to go. Well, if that's where it's at its highest, it has to go down. That loss of economic surplus is going to be what we call deadweight loss, okay? Excuse me. And then we'll think about how it impacts individually consumer and producer surplus as well, okay? So this idea of deadweight loss, it's not really a surplus, it's a loss of surplus. But it's a new thing that we have to be concerned about once that market is forced out of equilibrium by government actions, okay? So I've kind of already mentioned another way to think about deadweight loss. It's the total loss of surplus because we've moved away from the allocated efficient or the allocated efficient point or the equilibrium quantity. Okay. So let's think about price ceilings first. Okay. So usually we would use price ceilings to try to help who? If I'm thinking about a price ceiling, what does the ceiling do? It prevents me from going any. So if I put a price ceiling, that prevents the price from going any higher. So if I'm using a price ceiling correctly, what should it do? It should lower my price. Kind of counterintuitive. A price ceiling doesn't allow us to get up to that equilibrium price. It stops it at a lower point. Who's that going to benefit, do you think? Consumers, right? So we'll work through and kind of show this. A really good example, like anytime during war times, like materials that we need for building tanks and things like that, right? We've got some historical examples where the government came in and put price ceilings on certain products, basically so the government could buy it at a lower cost and produce these war materials, right? Now, we also see it more commonly used, like I said, presently, probably rent controls in larger cities to make sure that consumers or people have places to live, that they can afford to live in these kind of inner city areas, right? So what's it going to look like, okay? I'm going to draw this out and then come back to the slides. So the slides are always a good reference, but I always think, drawing these out by hand, I think it's sometimes easier to see, okay? So let's say I've got my quantity, and I could think about this as like the quantity of apartments, and I think about rent, which is really just the price of an apartment, right? So if I've got my demand curve, which represents consumers' marginal benefits, supply curve, which represents producer's marginal cost. And initially, this market starts out, it's an equilibrium, okay? Well, the government looks at this and says, okay, what would consumer and producer surplus be? Well, before, where would my consumer surplus be? The area below demand, but above the price. And where would producer surplus be? The area below the price, but above their marginal cost of their supply curve. So we're going to compare this scenario to what happens. I'm going to try to draw this as best I can without using rulers and taking up a bunch of time. So I'm going to want this here. So here's my demand curve. And I've got my supply curve looking something like this, okay? So if the equilibrium price were right here, what would happen if I said, I'm going to put a price ceiling? So let's say this was like, I don't know, the current rental price was like $2,000. What if I tell the producer, what if I say you can't charge a price over $3,000? What's going to happen in this market? Are they charging a price over $3,000? No. So any price ceiling set above the equilibrium is going to do what? Have absolutely no effect. It's not going to change anything. It's not what we call binding, right? So essentially, you want to think about any price ceiling above that equilibrium price, we would say is, I'm going to run out of room, but you guys can kind of spell it out, ineffective, right? Oh, sorry. Can you guys see that? Okay. So we know that to be an effective price ceiling, it needs to be what? Set below. So now if I tell these producers of apartments or people who are trying to rent them, you can't charge a price over $1,000. So this is going to be my effective price ceiling. Okay. So if this is the new price that I'm charging, how many apartments are consumers going to want to rent? Well, if this is the new price, the marginal benefit is greater than that all the way up to this point out here. So the new quantity demanded would be higher than before. That makes sense. If the price is lower, consumers, there's going to be more people who want to rent these apartments, right? Now, what's happened to my quantity supplied? At this lower price, not as many people are going to want to rent out their space, right? Maybe I'll rent it out to a business instead that's not subject to this price ceiling, right? When I rent it out to individuals who are living in these apartments, maybe I change that apartment to a, registered as a business, right, for businesses, and now I'm not subject to these price ceilings. So the new quantity supplied is going to be much lower. If that quantity supplied is less than my quantity demanded, what do I have? I have a shortage in the number of units. So these price ceilings will create a shortage in the number of units. Now let's think about the impacts on surplus. What is the new consumer surplus? So consumer surplus is the difference between what? The marginal benefit of the consumer and what their marginal cost is. What's their new marginal cost? The new lower price. So before, on that first unit, like this was my consumer surplus, now it's this entire area. And the next unit bought, and the next unit bought, and the next unit bought. The only problem is once we get to this quantity, so here we've got our new consumer surplus, and would a consumer want to rent this apartment here? Well, the marginal benefit is still above the price, so yes. Consumers want to go all the way out to this point. Notice, consumer surplus would be positive for all of these units. The problem is anybody renting out the apartment past this point? No, quantity supplied has now stopped at this lower quantity. So even though people want to buy these, they can't. So we don't have any consumer surplus coming from them because no one's actually renting those apartments. So you can kind of see we've lost a little bit of consumer surplus here, but they've gained much more, right? So our new consumer surplus is now the area of a rectangle and a triangle. So a little bit more difficult to calculate, but I think we can find the areas of rectangles and triangles and then add them together, right? And we'll kind of work through some examples with some numbers on an actual like graph here in a second. Now, so we've seen here with this lower price, kind of intuitively, what's happened to our price, or what's happened to our consumer surplus because of this price ceiling. Consumer surplus has increased. What about producer surplus? Well, intuitively, if the price is now lower, what do you think is probably going to happen to producer surplus? It's going to go down. So what's producer surplus now? It's the difference between the price that they are allowed to legally charge and their marginal cost. So now producer surplus is only going to be this much smaller triangle, right? So what's happened to producer surplus relative to before? We've lost all of what used to be producer surplus, and we've gained nothing. So with price ceilings, we've seen consumer surplus increase, producer surplus go down, okay? Any questions here before we keep moving? And sometimes I like to kind of give the full picture, and then we'll kind of go back and we'll rework some of these again. What does all of this represent? What was this before? Well, we were going up to that equilibrium quantity before. So all of this used to be economic surplus. Some of it came from producers, some of it came from consumers. What is this now? Deadweight loss, or we're not getting this surplus. So this is going to represent all of the surplus that was lost in this market because of this price ceiling. Okay? So when we have government interaction, we now have consumer producer surplus, but we also have a loss of surplus or deadweight loss. Okay? Any questions over anything in this graph before we go back to the slides? You have to speak up. Yeah, right? If I look at any price below the equilibrium, what's true about my supply curve or my quantity supplied relative to my quantity demanded? Every point below this, quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded, so I'm always going to have a shortage. Yep. So it's not going to quite be that. I've got some stuff I think that'll help in the slides with this. I didn't want to make this point yet, but since you're asking the question, notice part of that deadweight loss is going to be coming from producers, but part of it is also coming from consumers. So how do consumers benefit? Because even though they lost some surplus, what's true about this rectangle here? It used to be producer surplus, it's now consumers. So we have a loss of surplus to both individuals, but then we have a transfer of surplus from producers to consumers. That's how consumers end up better off here. Right? Producers end up even worse off because of this transfer. I don't know if that's grammatically correct, but yeah. Okay. Any other questions here? Okay. So kind of what we just did here, but if we're thinking about kind of what consumer and producer surplus looks like before, this was our market in equilibrium. The government then comes in and says, we don't think people should be paying as much for these apartments. We're going to lower the price. Well, what was the result of that? We said producer surplus, the area below price and above the supply curve, is now going to be much lower. Consumer surplus is now going to be much higher, right? Now, this isn't total consumer surplus. I left off this rectangle in the middle, which is this is what represents the transfer, what used to be producer surplus, but is now consumer surplus. So consumers have seen this large transfer of surplus from producers to consumers, and then we said deadweight loss is going to come somewhat from consumers, somewhat from producers. Okay. So price ceilings sound like a good idea, and it does benefit people who get an apartment here, right? But what is also true? the new we don't want to think about it as the equilibrium quantity, but what is the new quantity in this market after the price ceiling? Down here at 1.8 million instead of 2 million. So what's happening to those 0.2 million people? They are either leaving your city or they are roaming around your city, right? So what have we almost created here? Homelessness, and to some degree, right? There's no apartment unless you move from this area. There are no longer apartments out there that people can buy, right? So sounds like a good idea, but we've actually decreased total surplus in the market, and now people who don't, there's people that before had a place to live and now they don't. Okay, so price ceilings aren't a great idea, right? Now the people who kept their apartments or was able to find one, they're happy, right? It's also, I got a question, someone asked this about reading the module reading. It's a good question. When we're thinking about this market for apartments, it gets kind of weird because like you see these apartment complexes and you're like, okay, so they're just going to leave it like an empty space. Well, if we're thinking about supplying apartments, we're not necessarily, it gets a little more complicated in the real world because we have existing apartments which have like a set number. So maybe they want to minimize their losses, right, by just simply renting. But what are people not going to do if the price is lower? They're not going to build new apartment complexes, right? Or in my example earlier, they're going to take what used to be apartment space and they're going to, like you see all these apartment complexes doing this now, but instead of like, why do they have the first floor being mostly businesses? Because the price they can charge these businesses must be higher than what they could rent these out for a room, right? So that would be another way you could think about quantity of apartments changing here. Okay. So effective price ceilings, what we said, has to be set below the equilibrium price in order for it to be effective, right? We said it's going to lower the price we see in the market, but it causes a shortage in the number of units. I said waste resources here. Essentially, that's dead weight loss, right? We're decreasing total economic surplus. And we won't dive into it as much in this class, but like the next level of econ, you'd start to think about, well, if there's 0.2 million people now who used to have an apartment and now don't, what might people start doing? Renting out, I don't know, the space above their garage and not reporting it, right? And charging a higher price, right? In which case, the people who have to rent there, they're still going to end up paying a price above the price ceiling. So it can create black markets, which you haven't really solved the problem to begin with. You've just now created an underground illegal market. You can almost think about what's the most extreme example of a price ceiling? What would be the lowest I could put the price? 0? I could actually technically push it below 0 by doing what? Let's say the market for drugs. What's the price ceiling really there? Well, if you get caught with illegal drugs, you go to jail, right? I've essentially made the price negative, right? So what have I created? Well, now no one wants to supply those unless it is illegally. They're not reporting it. And so what have I created by making something illegal? Inherently, I'm going to create a black market where this market, because there's still people out there who want to buy and sell this product. I've just legally made the price 0 or negative. So now I just have a black market where it exists like it would have before. It's just now it's not reported. Now it's done illegally, right? And that comes with complementary, in production goods, people selling drugs tend to also do other nefarious things. And so we now have even more negative impacts on society, okay? So that's kind of a little bit of a, like I said, next level, but that is something we can kind of think about with these price ceilings. And then I kind of mentioned this already. If we set that price ceiling above the equilibrium price, we said it won't be effective. Nothing changes in the market. It remains in equilibrium. Consumer producer surplus stays the same, and deadweight loss would be nothing changes. If it's an ineffective price ceiling, deadweight loss is 0. Yep. Okay. I kind of have a different way of thinking about this, right? So if I have a binding or effective price ceiling, before consumer surplus would be the area above price, below the demand curve, so A, B, and E. Producer surplus would be the area below the price but above my supply curve, C, D, and F. Okay. Now, if I have this price ceiling, what's my new consumer surplus? Well, it's up to this new quantity. We said, yeah, consumers want to buy more, but if nobody's supplying anything to the market past this quantity, this is the new quantity on the market. So it'll reduce the quantity we see in the market. So consumer surplus is the area for every single one of these quantities, the difference between the demand curve and the new lower price they pay because of the price ceiling. So consumers went from having what? A, B, and E to A, B, and C. They lost this little triangle area E, but they gained this much larger area of C. So consumers are going to be better off. Okay. Now, what happened to producers? New producer surplus is just going to be the area below price but above the supply curve. So they went from having C, D, and F to now they only have this triangle of D. Right? So producers are worse off. Oops. So what happened? That area of C used to be producer surplus. It is now consumer surplus. So we saw a transfer of surplus because we lowered the price that benefited consumers, hurt producers. However, when we lowered the price, we also impacted the quantity in the market. That impact on quantity meant that for every unit in this range, no one is supplying these units, so they're not being produced or consumed. We're losing out on that surplus, which is going to be area E and F representing our dead weight loss, right? Part of that dead weight loss, area E, came from consumers, and part of that dead weight loss, area F, came from producers. So this is not the best way to memorize it, but what is always the triangle on top? Or not even triangle, even after we have government intervention, what shape on top that represents surplus to who? Consumers. The shapes or the triangle on the bottom represents surplus to our producers. And this will look a little bit different when we start to talk about price floors, taxes, and subsidies, but that's generally always going to be true. Consumer surplus is going to be some shape on top, producer surplus some shape on the bottom. Okay? All right. So we're calculating these areas. What would this look like with some actual numbers? So let's say I have this price ceiling of 40. I've got consumer surplus is what shaded area here? Well, I said it's the shape on top, and I've been trying to color code consumers as those blue areas, the difference between the new price and their demand curve. So I now have two shapes. I have to find the area of this triangle and the area of this rectangle. So the area of the rectangle is going to be what? 20 times 30, so 600, right? And then plus what? 30 times a half, so 600 plus 450 is 1,050, if I'm doing math in my head correct. So that's going to be my consumer surplus after the price ceiling. What was my consumer surplus before? How did I find this value? Well, what's the equilibrium price and quantity without any government intervention? Where supply is equal to demand, right? So at a price of 50 and at a quantity of 40, 50 times 40 was 2,000, but we said it's a triangle, so I then need to multiply it by 1/2. Wait, am I looking at this wrong? It's not 50, right? Why did I say that wrong? The equilibrium price is 50, but it goes up to 90, not 100. So what's the height of this triangle? It goes from 50 to 90, so 40 times that new quantity is 40, so 40 times 40 times a half, which is what gives me that 800. And then we said after we added the area of that triangle to the area of that rectangle, we've seen that consumer surplus has went up. Okay. Any questions there? Sorry for misspeaking there. I think the other graph we had, it started at 100. We're okay with this so far? Okay. So what was producer surplus before? Well, what's the equilibrium price and quantity? So the quantity was 40. That's always going to be the base of our triangle without any government intervention. The difference between that supply curve where it starts and that equilibrium price is also 40. So I had an example here where producer and consumer surplus started out as the exact same amount. What would my total economic surplus be here? Without any government intervention, so before this price ceiling, how do I find total economic surplus? I just add up consumer and producer. So 800 plus 800 is 1,600, right? After this price ceiling, what is producer surplus? Well, it's now going to be the area below this new price of 40, but above the supply curve, up to this quantity of 30. So area of this triangle will be what? 30 times, the height is 30, 30 times 30 times a half should give me 450. So what is total surplus after the price ceiling? It would be producer plus consumer surplus, which would be what here? 1,500. So we started out at 1,600. We went to 1,500. What should deadweight loss be? Now, if I didn't know, like I don't know how I wouldn't know that if I had this full graph, but let's say for some reason I was told only what producer and consumer surplus were before and after. I didn't have this graph. On this graph, what would also represent deadweight loss? This little red triangle, what does that really represent? What's the base of this triangle represent? So it would be the difference between the quantity after the price ceiling and the equilibrium quantity. So it's all the units that used to be produced and sold on the market that no longer are. That's where we're losing the surplus, right? It's not necessarily, we don't lose any surplus from those first 30 units, right? That surplus was all surplus before. Some of it has been transferred from producers to consumers, but the actual loss of surplus comes from the fact that the equilibrium quantity was higher than the new quantity after the price ceiling. All those units we're no longer seeing on the market. That's where that deadweight loss comes from. So what is this the area of? A triangle. So I have what? 20 times, the difference here is 10. 20 times 10 is 200 times, it's a triangle, so times a half would give me that value of 100. So I can calculate the area of that triangle. I could also, as a way to check this, if I calculate all these things, make sure the difference between total economic surplus before and after is that same value of that deadweight loss triangle that I found. They should be the exact same. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So we've got price floors. And let me double check here. I believe this is all price ceiling stuff. So, oops. What time is it? All right. So we'll go another. So this should show up on the home page now under that module 6 kind of heading. We'll take a look at this. Build this here. Go to preview. We'll start to think about this. Okay. All right. So I've got a couple here. We're looking at price ceilings. We didn't talk about price floors today. So we're just going to kind of focus on these first two questions. Okay. So after the fact, I'll go in and kind of update things so that it's only kind of using these first two questions as kind of scoring you. I always have more just in case we get through the material. So if I had this market, right, and it might not line up to what we had in the previous slides. So the numbers look similar, but it's not the exact same values. Okay. So if I have a price ceiling of $30 here, first of all, is this going to be an effective or an ineffective price ceiling? Effective, right? Why? Because it was set below. Kind of counterintuitive. A price ceiling, in order to be effective, has to be set below the equilibrium price. That's the only way it impacts anything. After this price ceiling, what's the new quantity I see in the market? So after this price, what was the old equilibrium quantity? Where supply is equal to demand, or 40. What should a price ceiling do? It should decrease the quantity that we see in the market. Right? So my new quantity at this lower price, quantity demanded will be higher, but quantity supplied at a lower price is going to be lower. Well, if no one's supplying it, can somebody buy it? No. So here, with a lower price, producers are going to dictate the new quantity we see in the market. So where will producers stop supplying this good? At a quantity of? Nobody has any idea? You just don't want to be wrong? 20, right? Why? Because every quantity past 20, what is true about my marginal cost? Remember, the supply represents the marginal cost to producers. Price would represent to them the marginal. If I sell something, the price is the marginal benefit. So the marginal benefit for every unit past this point is going to be what? Below my marginal cost. So am I going to want to supply that to the market? No. So suppliers are going to stop where their marginal benefit is equal to their marginal cost. The new marginal benefit is this new lower price the government sets. So that's going to be at a quantity of 20. If I'm thinking about consumer surplus now, I'm going to look at this new quantity of 20, and for every unit up to 0 to 20, consumer surplus will be the difference between what? Consumers' marginal benefits and their marginal costs. What is the marginal cost to consumers? When you buy something, what is the additional cost to you? This is not good for the next exam either, guys. If you buy something, what are you paying? The price. So the marginal cost to you is the price. You're consumers, right? We're almost so. The marginal cost to consumers will be this new lower price. What represents consumers' marginal benefits? My demand curve. So it's for all those first 20 units. What's the difference between my marginal benefit or the demand curve and that marginal cost or the new price I'm paying? So consumer surplus would be what? This entire area here. How would I calculate that? What two shapes is that? Triangle and a rectangle. So I've tried to lead you to water. This is where I'm not, kind of for the remainder, I'm not always going to give you the answers in class. So take a little bit of time. You should be able to calculate this on your own. I've identified even for you the area that we're looking at. All you should have to do here, the area of a triangle, 1/2 times base times height. And then we had the area of this rectangle here, okay? So I'll give you guys a minute or two, and we'll kind of move on to the next question. Huh? I can't hear you. What's up? So you can, yeah, so you can follow things down. Hmm? Yeah, I'll give you grid lines. All right. So, and I apologize if I'm being glib. I'm trying to poke at you guys to get you to respond to me. You know, it shouldn't be as, I'm not trying to be rude, but like, right, what are we doing? We are just finding the area of a rectangle here in a triangle, okay? So hopefully, you know, we need to get some practice doing this math. This should be math that we can do, you know, on paper, that you should be able, you're going to be expected to do on the quiz, on the exam. So I want you to start to get some more practice with these in class. I'll try to lead you to the correct answers, but I'm still probably going to save some of these problems that you have to work on your own. You can talk to the people around you, but we need to start getting some practice doing this, and then in real time see, am I making a very, you know, mistake that I need to make sure I'm not doing for the future, okay? All right, so this next one, we've just got drop downs of increase, decrease, and stays the same, right? So I have the exact same setup, right? With this price ceiling compared to if there was no price ceiling, what is going to happen to producer surplus, right? We said this new price is going to be 30. So what's the price you're all consumers. We got to switch mindsets. If I'm a producer and I sell something, the price becomes my marginal benefit. What represents a producer's or a supplier's marginal costs? The supply curve. So we can think about what consumer surplus would have, or sorry, producer surplus would have been at the old equilibrium price and the old equilibrium quantity. We said after this new price ceiling, it's effective, so it has to lower that price, and it's also going to do what? We said the quantity is going to move from 40 to 20. So think about how that's going to impact your producer surplus. And then what's going to happen to deadweight loss? Well, this one should be an easy one. Don't overthink it. What is deadweight loss without a price ceiling? Without government intervention, we're at total surplus is maximized, so deadweight loss is 0. Once I see an effective price ceiling, that means what's going to happen to my deadweight loss? Well, if it starts at 0, should be obvious what happens there. So kind of another minute or two I have this, so it closes out at 10:40. So get your responses in now. I'm going to switch off the quiz here in a second. Make sure you're kind of getting that submitted. So don't worry about, so only 1 and 2 is the only ones you have to answer. I'll kind of go back in and adjust these after the fact. We'll talk about price floors next. So just 1 and 2 are all we're working on right now. Is that clear? Just 1 and 2. So don't, all you have to answer is 1 and 2. I'll adjust things when I get back to my office this afternoon, okay?
Or is it?
You can answer them. I'm just going to go in after the fact and change them. Yeah, I'll leave them on there so you can see them later on. Yep. All right, so make sure you're getting these submitted before 10:40, which is in 1 minute. So try to get them submitted right now so they're not late. Also, moving forward, if you ever have Wi-Fi issues, what do you think? If you let me know 2 weeks after the fact, does that allow me a lot of ways to verify that you were in class? No, and that it was late because you were in class. So if you ever have any Wi-Fi issues getting submitted, please let me know after class. That way I can verify you're here, right? I can kind of then look at your response and change it from late, okay? All right, so get that submitted and we will then return to the slides, okay? We'll kind of set ourselves up for next class so we can kind of hit the ground running, okay? So we've talked about price ceilings. Those other 2 questions were for price floors, right? We didn't cover that yet. Those questions I'm going to keep in the quiz. It's just once I get back to my office later today, I'm going to adjust the quiz so it only counts points for those first 2. But you'll still have those to kind of review if you want to work on them. So if I think about price floors, it's going to work almost the exact opposite of price ceilings, right? In fact, it really will, right? So if instead of I'm lowering the price saying you can't charge a price above this, what does the floor do? It prevents me from going any. So where is an effective price floor going to be? If I have the current equilibrium price and I want the price to be not that, I have to put it above. That prevents me from getting back down to that lower equilibrium price. So effective price floors need to be set above our current equilibrium, the exact opposite of a price ceiling, okay? So the best example we have of this is the minimum wage, right? Whatever the minimum wage, like whatever the current equilibrium wage would be for minimum wage jobs, well, the government says that's too low. You can only pay people this amount. It prevents their wage from going any lower, okay? So an effective price floor needs to be set above our equilibrium price. And unlike a price ceiling, it won't cause a shortage. It's going to cause a surplus, okay? So I'll kind of build this out for us here. And we'll think about this kind of what we did for the price ceilings. I'll kind of give you the full picture, and then we'll kind of return to it next class and kind of build a little bit. So I'll do this in the context of the labor market. So if I've got the quantity of labor and the price of labor, which is really just someone's wage, right? Hourly wage rate. I would still have my supply curve representing my marginal costs, and I would have this demand curve representing marginal benefits. Okay, so I know the equilibrium price, or my equilibrium wage, if I want to think about it that way. And here was my kind of equilibrium quantity. Okay, so we would identify producer and consumer surplus the same way we did before, right? But let's think about what's going to happen if the government comes in and sets a price floor. Okay, so we said an effective price floor has to be set above the equilibrium, right? So let's say they come in and say, here's this minimum wage. You can't pay workers an hourly wage rate anything below this, right? Well, what's going to be my quantity supplied at this new higher price or this higher wage? Wherever I'm at on my supply curve, right? This is why we took so much time in what's the difference between supply and demand versus quantity supplied, quantity demanded. When there's a change in the price of a good, in this case, wages is the price of labor, the new quantity supplied, supply hasn't shifted. I'm just moving to a different point on the supply curve. What is my new quantity demanded at this higher price? Well, if the price is higher, consumers aren't going to want to buy as much. So if I've got the quantity demanded being less than my quantity supplied, I've created a what? A surplus. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. It's a surplus in the number of units, right? It's not economic surplus we're talking about. We're talking about surpluses or shortages in terms of the number of units, okay? So where is my new producer and consumer surplus? Well, what is consumer surplus going to be? The difference between what? What's the marginal benefit to consumers? I write it in here to remind you, demand. What is the consumer's marginal cost? That's going to be the, when you go buy something, the marginal cost to you is the price you pay. So it gets kind of weird when we think about like a labor market, because instead of being a consumer, you're all producers of labor when you work. It's kind of, so you kind of switch, it's kind of weird. But if we just think about in the context of like any good, here we would have our consumer surplus is still going to be that shape on top, right? The difference between price, or in this case, wage is our price, and that demand curve, okay? Now, what is producer surplus? That's going to be the difference between the producer's marginal costs, which is represented by the supply curve, and what's the marginal benefit to the producer of something? The price they sell it for. So now, producer surplus is still going to be that area on the bottom, but notice what's happened. Unlike a price ceiling, producers lost a little surplus, but they gained all of this. So what has happened to producer surplus with a price floor? Well, once again, if the price floor raises the price, right, who is that good for? Well, if the price is higher, is that good for consumers? Who is it good for? Producers. So what happens? We get this gain to producer surplus. Who is a higher price bad for? Consumers. So we saw consumer surplus would have been this entire area. After the price floor, it's going to be lower. And then what have we created? Anytime we have government intervention, as long as they've used the tool effectively, we have created a loss of surplus, or, heard a lot of you say it, deadweight loss. Where does deadweight loss come from? It's all the units that are no longer produced and sold in this market. Now, the reduction in quantity doesn't come from suppliers. Who now lowers the quantity? Nobody past this point is going to want to buy these units. So every unit here is no longer purchased. There's no longer anyone who gains any surplus from these. This would be our deadweight loss. So it's going to look similar to price ceilings in terms that it'll still create deadweight loss over there on the right-hand side. But now we've seen that instead of increasing consumer surplus, a higher price will increase producer surplus and lower consumer surplus. Okay, so it has like the exact opposite effects of a price ceiling. Okay. All right, so once again, let's start to I like to make some connections to the real world here. And I've had a couple of you stop by my office and just want to talk about these things, which I love, where you start to see this pop up, right? what if I see a lower quantity here? If this is the quantity of labor, that's like the number of workers. Using a minimum wage, what have I actually done? If I have a lower quantity of workers, I've created unemployment, right? Now, just like with price ceilings, if there's a higher wage, I know I worked plenty of these jobs. I'm sure some of you have as well. But if I want to pay a lower wage, I can still hire someone to do that. I just have to do it under the table or illegally, right? So I remember I worked for someone who did a bunch of home renovation stuff. They paid me in cash and they didn't pay me. They paid me a price below the minimum wage, right? So we create black markets just like we do when we have price ceilings, right? We create a lower quantity here. So even if I put a price floor on apartments, we don't see the government do that, but if they did, they would actually could create the same problem we had with a price ceiling, right? All that it does differently is these different tools will transfer surplus from consumers to producers. So if I'm thinking about the government, anytime you see a price ceiling where they lower the price, they're trying to probably gain votes because they're helping out consumers. If I use price floors, who am I actually helping out here? Producers. But now with a minimum wage, why would that still gain me votes? Who are the producers of labor? You and me. Companies are actually consuming labor, right? They're the ones who are demanding labor. So it gets kind of weird to think about when we talk about the labor market, but the same kind of thing exists, right? The government's using these tools. If I'm being a little bit, I view this with a negative lens, they're probably using these tools to appease you and gain votes, right? But yes, it's good if I keep my job here. If I'm a producer of labor, I now have this minimum wage, I'm better off. Who is not better off? All of these people who no longer have someone who's willing to employ them, right? So it comes with these trade-offs, right? Economics, we talked about very week one. Really, we're looking at essentially a lot of trade-offs with the different topics we're going to look at, okay? So before I let you out of here, do you have any questions on the exam still? I will now try to look at emails and get back to you. If I kind of, like I said, gave you a quick response before, it's because I knew I would kind of give you the spiel. Look for those grade changes on Canvas tomorrow to take place where I curve the exam. Also, I'll give you another piece of advice. And I get that we all have busy schedules, but when you're telling me, how can I do better on the next exam? How can I study? If after I use the in-class quiz, you get up and leave, it's a little rude. I don't take it personally, but who have you really hurt? Because it doesn't hurt me. Who is it hurting? You just missed us going through price floors. So you've now missed a bunch of content that we're really not going to spend a lot of time on next class. So I understand the in-class quizzes are points. Those points are so minimal compared to the getting one more question correct on an exam that staying for this price floor, if it's stuck at all, you just cost yourself way more points by leaving early than just staying here till we did that in-class exam, okay? That's my spiel. I will see you guys in class on Thursday. If you guys have any questions, I will be here till my next class starts. Yep.